All right, so it's a couple minutes after 7 and we're going to get started. Hi and good evening, and welcome to the Souhegan River Rail Trail webinar. I'm Matt Watkins. I'm a planner with the Nashua Regional Planning Commission, and I'm here along with colleagues from our regional, the Nashua Region Complete Streets Committee, and also with colleagues from Friends of the Souhegan Valley Rail Trail group. So some housekeeping. This is a webinar. You can participate using the Q&A feature. We're going to answer questions at the conclusion of our presentation tonight, and we are recording this webinar. So your co-hosts this evening include myself and Chris Buchanan, who is a resident of Amherst, and my coworker, Mason Twombly, will be working in the background to field your questions and make sure the webinar proceeds smoothly. So again, thank you for coming. I mentioned complete streets. By definition, complete streets are streets for everyone. They're designed and operated to enable safe access for all users, including pedestrians and bicyclists and motorists, transit riders of all ages and abilities. Complete streets make it easy to cross the street, walk to shops, bike to work. They also allow buses to run on time and make it safe for people to walk to and from train stations. And again, they also accommodate motor vehicles. So our Regional Complete Streets Committee meets regularly to discuss ideas for how to incorporate complete streets concepts into the transportation system in the Nashua region. And now those of you who are from the region, some of you here tonight may not be, but those of you who are familiar with New Hampshire Route 101A understand that it's the primary east-west corridor in the Nashua region, and it does a terrific job of accommodating motor vehicles, but a less than terrific job accommodating pedestrians and bicycles and other alternative modes. And so there is also in very near the corridor is an active railroad right-of-way. There's a freight line through there, active freight line. It runs parallel to Route 101A. And the Complete Streets Committee has been discussing the idea of developing a rail width trail or a rail trail in or near that railroad right-of-way that would better accommodate bikes, pedestrians, and other alternative transportation modes. So that the private railroad company that owns the right-of-way has put its holdings up for sale. There's no telling who will end up purchasing that right-of-way and those holdings, or what they will eventually do with it. We certainly would love to see that's remains an active line. There is some freight that travels along that branch currently. We'd love to see that continue and perhaps also have this shared use trail be part of that corridor. So the Friends of the Souhegan Rail Trail has formed to advocate and plan for the possibility of incorporating, a non-motorized shared use path in or alongside that rail line, whether it remains active or not. And certainly look forward to, hopefully having a conversation with whoever the eventual owner of that corridor, that right-of-way is. So the objective for tonight is to provide some background about trends in bike ped safety. We're going to provide a description of existing conditions along Route 101A and also along the railroad right-of-way. We're going to talk a little bit about organizational efforts of the Friends of the Souhegan Valley Rail Trail and how you could become involved with our efforts. So I'm going to hand this over to Chris Buchanan, who's going to run through a description of what we're talking about and get into a little more detail. So thank you. And Chris, it's all yours.
Well, hi, folks. My name is Chris Buchanan. I am the chairman of the Amherst Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. I'm also a fire captain in Amherst. And I also work for the New Hampshire Department of Safety, but really my passion has been with transportation and safety around that for some time. And that is what led me to the Regional Complete Streets Advisory Committee. I appreciate the background there, Matt. That's a pretty good overview, and I'll be going into a little bit more depth about the details of what Matt talked about there. The first thing that I just wanted to mention before I get going is that if you're not going to stick around until the end, one thing we are looking is for additional volunteers or other help that we can get with this effort. So if that's something that you're thinking you might be able to do, you can go to Souhegan Valley Rail Trail.org /join, and you can sign up to be part of the organization. And just like with other volunteer commitments, it can be pretty much as much or as little as you'd like. So I hope you might consider that. So just a little bit of an agenda about what I'll be going over today. I'll principally be talking about the vision of what the Souhegan Valley Rail Trail can be, and the information that went into where we are now, why we're talking about this, the details of it, and then what's next. So I'll just go ahead and start talking about the vision for what the rail trail could be. So the first thing that we'll be doing is I'm going to break it into about 5 sections here. The first one will be the need, about why alternative transportation in this region is pretty important. Then I'll talk about the benefits, which is how alternative transportation can really enhance the region in some surprising ways. The route that was selected as a candidate and the concept of how it could be adapted into a rail trail, and then a strategy for how it can be done. So first, sometimes you hear bicycles and pedestrians, or non-motorized transportation, or multimodal transportation. All of these jargony terms can be hard to follow. I've kind of landed with alternative transportation here in that we understand what cars and trucks are, but not everybody uses cars and trucks all the time. So what really is alternative transportation? Well, it's all sorts of things, and you see them all the time. They're all around, and some people get around by walking or biking or whatever it might be. So just know that going forward. So the need. First thing is worth acknowledging is that the roads in the United States are made for cars. They aren't typically made for people at all. And this can be plainly visible when you see people walking on the side of New Hampshire 101A or some of your neighborhood streets in the area. It might be hard to identify with the people who do this because often we are driving in our cars, and when you're in a car, you're in a little box where you're isolated from the rest of the world. But the reality is that the way that we engineer our roads has historically been to maximize the vehicular volume of cars. And unfortunately, the safety of humans, and whether that be bicyclists, pedestrians, or others, is often a secondary, tertiary, or some later even consideration in the design of the roads itself. To explain how that's actually the case, there's something called Ramborg's fatality probability chart, which is it's a way to analyze the energy that's absorbed by the human body in a collision. You'll see on the left side here, we have the fatality probability, and on the top we have speed in miles per hour. And there are some really plain trends about this. The first one is that if you're a pedestrian or cyclist, a person who's on the side of the road, and you're hit by a car at 0 miles an hour, you're going to be probably okay. But at 70 miles an hour, the chances of fatality are near certain. But there's this trend that occurs at about 18 miles an hour up to about 35 miles an hour, where the probability of fatality increases dramatically. And well, there's actually another line, and this is the same sort of thing, except when you're in a car. you have the added energy absorption of the energy of the car, rather the engineering of the car, which moves that same pattern higher up. So when you're in a car, you're able to sustain greater energy without dying. But nevertheless, that's the same sort of phenomenon that happens. So the result is that we get these three naturally occurring categories of road. This first one, below the first threshold, it's an environment in which cars and people can be mixed safely without a dramatic probability of fatality, so long as the cars do not exceed that threshold. Then there's a middle category where generally you should separate people from cars so that there is no possibility for cars to hit people at those fatal speeds. And there's actually a third category where you should start separating cars from cars by direction so that the probability of head-on collisions becomes impossible. So this is systematic safety. And you should try to think, where do you go in your daily life? And if you were to go to the grocery store or to work, think about the roads that you take on your way to your destination. Are those roads accommodating for you if you needed to walk or bike there? Which category would those roads fit into? Do you find that cars are mixing with people at speeds that are higher than that fatal probability threshold? Chances are it's pretty high because that's the way most of our roads are designed. And this reality is plainly visible in some rather disturbing numbers. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has been keeping track of fatality data since the 1970s. And there's an unfortunate trend that's been happening recently where since 2009, the last year of complete data is 2018, 58,479 people have been killed by cars. That's on average about 16 people per day or one person every 89 minutes. It's really the equivalent of about a 747 crashing with no survivors every single month. And that's the reality of roads where we do mix cars with people without giving them a safe infrastructure option. And well, sometimes people respond, well, why doesn't everyone just drive? Because then it won't be an issue anymore. Well, the reality is that 25% of Americans either don't own a car or can't drive a car. That's 80 million people. Whether they're too old or too young, or they're disabled, or they can't afford one, there are many reasons why somebody might not have a car and be reliant on other modes of transportation. So the next thing is that just having a car is generally one of the more expensive ways to travel. If you think about the amount that you put into purchasing a car and then repairing the car and then fueling the car, et cetera, the reality is it's a lot more expensive than a bike that you might purchase and never fix or something along those lines. And the result is that if you make less than $25,000 a year, you're 9 times less likely to own a car. And as a result, that means that these people have a significant disadvantage when it comes to accessing vital services. And just worth noting that that's above the poverty level in New Hampshire. So the reality is that this isn't just a somewhere else problem. And I'll get into a little bit of detail about how this is a reality here as well. We might just think about maybe dense urban areas as a place that would have this issue. And the reality is, no, it's here too. So, all right, alternative transportation, we might need it, but what are the benefits of it? Beyond just accessibility and enhanced safety, are there some other things that we can have if we have more alternative transportation in the area? Well, the first thing is that, yeah, there's plenty of economic benefits. There are a lot of numbers here, so I'm going to try not to dwell on them for too long, but one thing that's worth noting is that for each dollar that is invested in alternative transportation, a study in the 2010s revealed that 115% of each dollar that is invested in alternative transportation is returned to the local economy. And this was seen in New Jersey, but also there's some interesting comparisons to how investment in vehicular infrastructure is just actually less so, and things of that nature. So if you think about investing in vehicular infrastructure, the reality is that cars and their parts and the fuel that comes with cars are not manufactured in Hillsborough County, New Hampshire. When we purchase these things, a lot of the money is actually going elsewhere. And conversely, when you think about how a bicycle could be purchased at Goodale's or from your neighbor, and the way that a bicyclist could then engage with businesses, it's just rather different than a car. But I'll skip the numbers that are on the screen. I'm not going to just read PowerPoint to you. So the last point on that is that if you picture yourself perhaps driving down Route 101A, the speed at which you're driving is likely at or around 40 miles an hour. Your opportunity to see local businesses is actually quite fleeting. And that might not be an issue for those magnet stores that are in the area where people are going to be going to them no matter what. But if you're a small business, or if you are struggling to keep your business afloat, and maybe not everyone knows about your business, it's hard to get the attention of people who are flying by at 40 miles an hour. But someone who's walking by or biking by actually has plenty more time to see your business, think about whether or not they're going to go to your business, and envision themselves doing that. As a result, there are some pretty interesting trends about how having walkability, bikeability, alternative transportation, et cetera, near commercial corridors leads to significant increases in local and small business economic activity. There's a case study to take a look at. This is actually fairly recent, 35 miles of protected alternative transportation system in the Baltimore Greenway. Yielded some interesting data. Again, I'm not going to just read PowerPoint to you, but there were some significant estimates in how this affected the local economy. So as to say that it was surprisingly positive. Well, not just economic activity. So the US Department of Interior did a study of about 90,000 home sales. And the result was that the average increase in home sale, if a house is deemed walkable or bikeable, is between $4,000 and $34,000 increase to comparable houses without that walkable or bikeable label. And that's 90,000, that's an inventory of 90,000 home sales around the country. So that's fairly comprehensive. There's another study that was actually fairly recent and local, and that's the Nashua River Rail Trail, which terminates in Nashua but goes south to Air. There was a study done there that indicated that home sales were reduced by about 41%. So if you were trying to sell your house and you lived on or near the rail trail there, you actually sold your house faster as a result. Furthermore, this might seem a bit more obvious, is that more than a third of Americans are obese. And if you think about how we get around, just driving and sitting all the time these days, it's kind of hard to have the recommended 60 to 150 minutes of physical activity that you need. So that's 60 minutes per day, roughly 150 minutes per week. Having increased walkability and bikeability allows for people to safely and comfortably go around and move more often. The prospect of this rail trail that we'll be discussing in just a moment is actually, it forms a transportation corridor, which means that people will be able to commute to work and other things like that on their bike, and something that might seem just ridiculous if you think about 101A, for example. The Safe Routes to School initiative was a federal program that allowed for local communities to, it was a grant program to build facilities so that students can bike and walk to their schools. And just by doing that, they saw that there was an increase of biking and walking to school by 20 to 200%. So there are measurable results of doing these sorts of things. And I guess the last thing I'll mention for a benefit is just that you can just think about road rage and the rush hour traffic and how unpleasant it might be to intermix with your neighbors, which is who they are. And that it's just generally not a pleasant experience to drive around most of the time, especially in traffic. But rail trails offer a pretty different experience, and just having alternative transportation, you're no longer in a little box, you're no longer stuck in traffic. You're able to engage with your community and your neighbors. And this is just an interesting quote that I got from the Manchester Moves website, where they talked about the Piscataqua Rail Trail in Goffstown as culturally one of the best things that has happened in the region. Well, okay, so those are some of the benefits, but let's take a look at what it is we've been talking about for a while. And that's the route that we're talking about. So this is the Souhegan Valley. In the right there, you'll see Nashua. I know it might not be too visible, but can you see my mouse? So in the right here is Nashua, and then we have Merrimack and Milford here and Wilton. So going northwestern. This is the Hillsborough Branch Rail Line. If you've driven on parts of New Hampshire 101A, you may have seen a rail line from time to time. Chances are you didn't see a train on it, but maybe sometimes. The Hillsborough Branch Rail Line is owned by Pan American Railways from North Billerica, Massachusetts. And the segment that they own begins at Crown Street in Nashua, and it goes 16.36 miles northwesternly to Wilton Center, where that railroad changes hands to the state of New Hampshire. The rail line actually has two operators. You'll see here, there's a kind of a bluer portion where Pan American is the exclusive operator of the rail line. And then there's a green area in the northwest where it is shared. Trackage rights are shared between Pan American Railways and the Milford-Bennington Railroad. Milford-Bennington offers a shuttle service that goes from a quarry in Wilton down to West Milford. So that's for the, I think it's the Granite State Concrete Company. So they run a shuttle service that tends to move 10 cars of raw materials for concrete processing. The state of the rail line is, well, it could be better. It was, it is still an active rail line, but general improvements have not been done in a substantial amount of time. Recently, in preparation for the potential sale of the rail line, wooden ties have been upgraded, but still the tracks themselves, which is the biggest part of the rail line, remain as they were. The state of the rail is, well, you can just see pretty clearly from that photo there. It makes it very difficult to operate. As a result, there are somewhat frequently derailments that have occurred. I've been able to find several of them that have happened in just the past decade. This one is at Main Street in Nashua. Thankfully, nothing very serious has happened. There have been derailments, including trains that have had hazardous materials on them, but there were no spills or anything like that to date. The state of the rail, as you saw in that photo back there, is the determining factor on the rating, which is provided by the Federal Railroad Association Administration. I don't remember which one it is, but the US government. And there are various classes that based off of the track you can take your freight or your passenger lines and go at different speeds. And the classification of the Hillsborough branch is actually not depicted on this. It's below all of that. It's the accepted classification, which means that the rail line is limited to 10 miles an hour for a speed limit for freight, and then they are barred from any sort of passenger rail activity. There was a report that came out in 2018 from the Surface Transportation Bureau where the Pan American released the cost of what it would take to just elevate the classification of the rail from accepted to class 1. And what was indicated in that report was that it would cost about $167,000 per mile just to elevate the track to the lowest class available there, which would have the same speed limit for freight at 10 miles an hour and theoretically could have passenger rail at 15 miles an hour. The reason why the track may not have been upgraded over all these years is the economic viability of most of this track is, it's just a little bleak. In terms of the Milford-Bennington Railroad, they have a shuttle service that has been operating for some time, and you just saw a video of it, and it's somewhat of an essential activity that happens in the Wilton area. The raw materials that Milford-Bennington transports in that shuttle service it's very valuable. It keeps those heavy materials from driving down downtown Wilton and on municipal streets in the area. But most of the other rail line sees very little use. And there has been little incentive for Pan American to comprehensively overhaul the rail line in a very long time. And as these are two different companies, there isn't much of an incentive for Pan American, the owner of this track, to upgrade the portion that Milford-Bennington uses, as they're just different companies. So just taking a look at the state of New Hampshire DOT's rail plan, they did an assessment of the state of rail in New Hampshire and other freight. And you'll see that the vast majority of freight in New Hampshire is transported by truck. This should be somewhat unsurprising, as if someone were to say freight to you, you might normally think of semi-trucks driving down the highway. It looks like that rail only accounts for 6.3% of all freight tonnage in the state of New Hampshire. But you'll see actually of that 6.3%, 5.3% of the total share is for through freight. So that's freight, rail freight that starts and ends in other states. And that freight is merely passing through New Hampshire, perhaps on its way to or from Maine or something like that. And the rail that originates or destinates in the state of New Hampshire only makes up 0.9% of all freight tonnage in the state. And the Hillsborough branch is in that category right there. So there isn't very much growth potential for increased freight activity. It seems quite clear, especially when you consider the expense of overhauling the track condition versus the possibility of economic expansion. It just makes it very challenging economically to overhaul the rail. So a little bit of information about the rail. As was mentioned earlier, Pan American indicated that they are looking to sell all of their real estate holdings July of this year. That's when it came out, and that remains the case. The state of New Hampshire DOT reserves the first right of refusal for any railway sale that happens, meaning that they, if a sale is to happen of that rail line, the state of New Hampshire can actually step in and provide either stipulations to the sale or to buy it outright for whatever reason. And there are cases of the state of New Hampshire getting involved with rail corridors such as these. The most recent one is that September of last year, the New Hampshire DOT, as approved by Governor Sununu and the Executive Council, purchased nearly 10 miles of abandoned rail bed from Pan American Railways for rather using 100% federal monies. Well, that's the background about the route. So what could we do with it if such a thing could happen in the Souhegan Valley? Well, the first thing is we should recognize what this route represents. When you drive down New Hampshire 101A, it's quite clear that this highway goes through much of the Souhegan Valley. It's kind of the economic heart of the region, or at least a good portion of it. And that's seen quite clearly when we look at the vehicular volumes along New Hampshire 101A, where it approaches nearly 50,000 cars per day in some areas. And the Hillsborough Branch rail line almost directly parallels New Hampshire 101A in its entirety. There's some parts in Merrimack or in Amherst, especially in Milford and Wilton, where you can see the proximity of this rail line to New Hampshire 101A, and you can clearly picture if 101A has the transportation potential that it does, what could an alternative transportation network offer us in more or less the same corridor? Well, 115,000 people live within 2 miles of that corridor. There are 63,000 jobs. And getting back to the need and how this is a local problem as well, is that we have, within just 2 miles of the rail line, the Hillsborough Branch rail line, 3,000 households do not have vehicles and rely on other forms of transportation to get around. And that need is clearly indicated by the fact that also within 2 miles, there are 368,000 annual rides on the Nashua transit system, which is only in that eastern part, in that Nashua area of the whole corridor. Well, so taking a look at the route, we've gone ahead and divided it up into a few different sections where if we were to take that 16.36 miles of the Hillsborough Branch rail line and divide it up into segments that are unique to their characteristics, there are about 5 different sections that we're looking at. So over here in the east, this is downtown Nashua. On the right, where the green line starts, is the beginning of this rail line. And that's at 25 Crown Street. That's where the New Hampshire Park and Ride currently is. And it's also the site of the potential passenger rail station that can be there in the future. And then the rail line goes northwesternly. It crosses Main Street and continues northwest to Broad Street, where this subsection ends. And then going northwest, here is subsection 2, where it begins at Broad Street and then goes northwesternly right behind most of the commercial businesses that you might interact with nearly every day. And then it ends at Northwestern Boulevard. So this is about where Market Basket is, or one of the market baskets along 101A. And then continuing northwesternly for the next subsection, we have subsection 3. So this one goes through a small piece of Merrimack, an even smaller piece of Hollis, and then a big portion of southern Amherst, continuing along the commercial corridor of 101A. This section ends at 122, based off of an engineering need to cross the road, where it gets a little complicated there. And then the next section picks up at 122 and continues through the heart of Milford. Interestingly, Milford itself and its population is almost bisected by this rail line. And if it were to go through the town of Milford, the vast majority of the town would be very close to this rail trail and would have it would just be an unprecedented transportation opportunity for non-vehicular use. So this subsection ends at Westchester Drive, where our recommendation is that a different configuration starts up, which I'll get to in just a second. And so this last section is section B, which begins at Westchester Drive in Milford and then continues west to Wilton Center. The defining characteristic of this portion of the prospective rail trail is that it would be best suited to have rail with trail here, as this is where the Milford-Bennington rail line, railway operates, and we wouldn't want to interfere with that activity. So rail with trail, what does that mean? So there are a couple of different configurations that I just want to talk about briefly here. And the first is that a standard rail trail is a shared use path. It's typically 10 to 12 feet wide. It's not particularly surprising what it is. If you've ever been to a rail trail, it looks like that. So rail with trail, however, is a little bit different. If you're going to have a shared use path next to an active rail line, there are two different configurations offered by the Federal Highway Administration as well as the state of New Hampshire DOT, where it's really just based off of how much room do you have left in the right-of-way. If the right-of-way allows you to have this unconstrained width configuration, then it's pretty simple. You just put the path a certain distance away from the train tracks. But if the right-of-way is constricted by width, then there is another configuration you can have which mandates the installation of a fence. And that configuration actually already exists in New Hampshire up in Laconia. So rail with trail exists in New Hampshire, and it's actually fairly common around the country, but it exists too. Okay, well, all right, so all of that sounds really great, but what are we going to do about it? And so there are really just about 6 steps that can be taken in order to make this a reality. And just to kind of go through the process, the first thing would be that an organization needs to be formed. And the good news is there is one now. It's the Friends of the Souhegan Valley Rail Trail. It's an organization that we're hoping you might consider joining today, as this group can be the arbiters of this project, to be there and stay on it and make sure that whatever opportunities happen. Well, okay, so now that there's a group, what's next? The second step is generally to have a grassroots movement. Events like this, where we're spreading the word about this activity, other events, even though it's very difficult to have events these days, whatever it might be, we need to have the region be informed as to what this project is, what it could be, and have them participate in the process. Whatever the vision is, it might change a little bit with public input. Who knows? But if there is broad public support for this project, it is far more likely to happen. And along those lines, with that broad support, we can work with public officials, key figures, whether they be in the DOT or at Pan American Railways, whatever it is. Those people are the people who are going to make this happen or not. It's really just a select number, maybe a few dozen people who, if they believe that this is a valuable initiative, that they would have the ability to make it happen. The next thing would be that funding has to happen. You can't build a rail trail, you can't build a road, you can't do almost anything without money. You certainly can't procure the right-of-way without money. So funding is going to be an essential part of this. If we wanted to build the entire route all at once, it would require a lot more money than doing little segments over time. But even building the whole route at once is actually a possibility, which I wouldn't have said that just 1 year ago. But the reality is that with the landowner indicating that they are interested in selling all of their real estate holdings, and also interestingly, in terms of timing, the federal government's expressed interest in having some form of a transportation bill in the near future, possibly, this could be somewhat serendipitous timing in terms of getting a federal grant, perhaps, and also purchasing the route. But really, that's just one option. There are dozens of different ways to do this in terms of funding or other ways. There are just many. But interestingly, it's possible that the entire route is on the table potentially. Next would be that once you are securing funding, we have to obtain access to the corridor. You can't go build a rail trail on somebody else's land. You need to either own the land outright or have an easement or have some other agreement in which the right-of-way is made accessible to the project. And then the last thing would be to promote and build projects, whether that be the entire route all at once or just a small segment of 50 feet. Each little piece adds up, and over time, the hope would be to make a single contiguous corridor. Well, as I mentioned, the people who are hoping to make this happen are the Friends of the Souhegan Valley Rail Trail, and those steps of what I just discussed are the mission of this organization. So if you are interested in getting involved in it, I would strongly encourage you to consider signing up. You can go to souheganvalleyrailtrail.org/join. You can also find us on social media. If you search for Souhegan Valley Rail Trail, we're on Facebook. There's also a Facebook group and Instagram. And that's generally the overview of what the rail corridor project could be and how a rail trail could really transform the Souhegan Valley region. I'll just briefly take a look here at what the possible next steps are at this point. Well, today we're hoping to maybe get a couple of people to join the organization. And then our next activity is that I will be back again with Matt, and we will be doing another webinar just like this, except the audience will be intended for general audiences. So it's a public webinar. We're really hoping to get as many people as we can to attend this. So we could use your help in promoting it if you find that this effort is something that you're interested in. That's going to be on December 3rd at 7 p.m. We will go ahead and send an email again with the link to the webinar for that. But we certainly could use your help in making that be known. And then going forward, just some of those steps that I just mentioned, we are beginning to start that process. By having this event and the next one, we are hoping to develop that grassroots movement with which we can have that support to go to public officials, start talking to folks in Washington. Who knows, maybe a transportation bill is on the horizon. Maybe it's 10 years from now. It's hard to say, but with the support of other people in the area, we can start to approach our elected officials. The organization itself is working on bylaws and is hoping to obtain a nonprofit status so that we can have a tax deductible donation soon. And then starting in 2021, it's just the rest is the future. So once again, we will have the next public information session on December 3rd at 7 p.m. Information about that will be on our social media, and we'll send out an email. It's also on our website. And at that, I would say it's a good opportunity for questions if anyone has any. I'd invite Matt to come back, and if you have any questions, you can go ahead and submit them by typing them in to the question and answers button that's in your Zoom panel. And I'll probably stop talking here and give people a chance to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Good job. I don't know how I could, really add much to that. I did see there was a question earlier, and I can yeah. I don't see any questions. I see a comment. Thank you, Julie. But yeah, I think, Chris, you really covered it. I'm glad you emphasized that, in perfect world, there'd be, there'd be an active rail line through there, and that would accommodate this, this shared use path, and just, because we're, you know, um, the more modes of transportation, the better. Is really, I think, what this group is about. So there are some questions. Mason, did you want to read those? Since
Yeah, I'll ask you guys the questions. We've got 3 so far, and I'm gonna touch on one that we got asked during the presentation. Janet Langdell asked about if we were going to have this recorded. So we are recording this webinar. It's going to be available on our website, and I will send a link out to everybody. So I answered that, but I'm not sure if everybody saw that. So I figured I'd address that. So the first question we have is, do you have an estimate on the cost to acquire the corridor?
It's a little difficult to give a precise answer to that right now. What I have done is taken the math from 2019, where I mentioned that the state of New Hampshire purchased 9.8 miles from Pan American, the Hampton branch, and that purchase was for $5 million. It's also worth noting, though, that purchase occurred when Pan American was not announcing that they are looking to sell their real estate holdings. So usually when you put your house up on the market, it kind of changes that number, as opposed to if someone is trying to buy your house from you unsolicited. So while it's a little hard to say exactly how much it would cost, that does provide a little bit of context. And I think that determining the price is going to be one of the first things that we have to figure out.
Right. Thank you. So the next question is, what is the state of New Hampshire doing with the section of the rail trail we own from Wilton north?
Well, right now that state-owned portion is currently used by the Milford-Bennington rail line. The quarry that I mentioned, they start their shuttle service is along that route. So they actually have trackage rights along the state portion. And then in Wilton, it changes hands to Pan American, and they have trackage rights over about 5 or so miles of the Pan American portion, and they end their operations in West Milford. So technically it's in use right now, the state portion, and it actually goes all the way up to Bennington, New Hampshire, where it becomes a rail trail, the Hillsborough Rail Trail, I think it's called, and that's starting in Bennington and continuing north. So the rail line ends in Bennington.
All right, and then the last one is, do you have any data on the seasonality of bicycle commuting for this latitude? And if it's around like 9 months, or what that looks like at this latitude.
Yeah, so I don't have figures available on the spot. However, I have looked into this quite a bit, and there are many latitudes farther north than we are here that have regular biking. For example, the Netherlands is a pretty clear example where they are a fair bit farther north than us and continue to have biking, but of course, they have somewhat of a different climate than we have here. You can continue going north into Scandinavia, where dedicated bicycle facilities exist there and are used 12 months a year. And the hope with this particular project would be that it is truly a transportation corridor. I think that sometimes when people hear rail trail, they assume something that is purely used for recreational purposes. And while this certainly could be used for recreational purposes, the intent is for it to be a transportation corridor, which would mean that it would be paved and it would be plowed and it would be used all the time. So without any specific numbers that I have memorized or anything like that, people do bike in the winter. They bike farther north of here, and the hope would be to make this accommodating of that.
All right. The next one is, how wide is the rail trail property, or the right of way?
variable. It's hard to give a specific answer for that. In some places it's wider than others. In some places it's more narrow.
All right. And then somebody did ask how many people are viewing. And I'll just say that we have 17 attendees tonight. A couple of people have popped up at this point, but and Julie did comment, Julie Chismis, who works for the city of Nashua, did comment that they have Strava data that shows we have year-round cycling in Nashua, and we've had many requests for separated bike trails that are maintained year-round. So that is addressing the point from some of the earlier questions. So thank you for that, Julie. And that looks like it's it as far as questions, unless anybody has anything else that they want to ask.
Well, while we're giving people a couple of extra minutes to type in their questions, I would indicate it looks like some people have come in a little later and asked a couple of questions. The webinar will be available afterwards. We have a recording of this, so we'll be able to upload it as well.
So there's just a comment from Francis Doherty. The Wilton Railway pretty much stops at the quarry. In the winter, it's open to snowmobiling and is the only conduit to Canada from this area. So that's just an interesting aside. And just comments about what a good job you guys did. So excellent. And to thank you for for the good presentation, the preliminary work you guys have done. And again, we're gonna, this has been recorded, so we will, I'll email this out to everybody that's been here tonight, and we'll be in touch more about the webinar in December. That looks like it's it for questions, guys. So unless we have anything else. Matt,
All right.
Are you all set?
Yeah, I think we're set. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And you can communicate with me or Chris, and we can go from there. And see you December 3rd for a similar presentation and a continuing effort to just keep getting the word out about possibilities moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks for joining, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Have a good night, everybody.
All right.